The strange punishments for medieval monks breaking the rules. This is what actually happened when a medieval monk broke the rules, and the rules they broke ranged from the mundane to the genuinely scandalous. The punishments were systematic, public, and in some cases physical, built into a graduated system designed not just to correct behavior but to do it in front of everyone. This is the full story of monastic discipline, from the minor infraction to the ultimate consequence. The Rule of Saint Benedict did not assume monks would be perfect. It built an entire disciplinary framework around the expectation that they would not be, establishing a graduated scale of correction that moved from quiet warning through social isolation, bread and water, corporal punishment, and ultimately expulsion. The logic was pastoral before it was punitive. The goal was to bring the erring monk back into conformity with the community, not simply to hurt him. But the methods available for achieving that goal included genuine physical pain and genuine social humiliation, and the rule was explicit about when each was appropriate. Understanding the punishment system means starting with how infractions were identified and judged. Every monastery held a daily chapter meeting at which monks were expected to confess their own faults before the assembled community. A monk who had spoken unnecessarily, who had laughed during the divine office, who had failed to kneel deeply enough before the altar, or who had slurred the words of a psalm was expected to stand before his brothers and admit it. The chapter meeting was simultaneously a governance assembly, a disciplinary court, and a public confession booth, and the combination gave the abbot and prior direct, daily information about what was happening in the community. Visitation records from Hales Abbey in Gloucestershire, a Cistercian house with surviving documentation from multiple inspections conducted between the mid-13th and mid-15th centuries, show exactly what kind of faults attracted censure. The monks of Hales were admonished for not kneeling deeply enough in front of the high altar. They were criticized for failing to celebrate a daily mass in honor of the Virgin Mary, to whom the abbey was dedicated. The quality of their chant was examined, hurrying through the psalms, slurring words, singing at the wrong pitch. All of these attracted specific criticism from visiting abbots. The monks were also recorded visiting taverns, a violation that went well beyond poor liturgical performance. On one occasion, a group of Hales monks was admonished for ganging up on a fellow brother over allegations of sexual misconduct, allegations that had been investigated and disproven. The punishment in that case was directed at the monks who had spread the rumors and created the social conflict, not at the accused. The formal punishment scale in the rule began with private admonition, a quiet word from the abbot or prior, delivered without public shame. A single offense that the monk seemed genuinely sorry for might never go beyond this stage. If the fault continued, or if the monk showed no contrition, the next step was public rebuke, correction delivered in front of the assembled community at the chapter meeting. The effect was deliberate. A monk who had been privately warned and ignored the warning now faced the knowledge that everyone in the house knew what he had done and heard him addressed about it. A monk who persisted beyond public rebuke entered the first stage of formal excommunication. This did not mean expulsion from the church. It meant exclusion from the life of the community. The excommunicated monk ate alone, separated from the refectory table. He was not permitted to lead any part of the divine office. He could not speak to his brothers. His status in the community was that of someone suspended from full membership, visibly set apart at every point in the day where community life was otherwise communal. The monk's food during excommunication was reduced to bread and water. Records from Egglestone and Liston Abbeys document canons placed on exactly this minimal diet after being reprimanded for talking, specifically for chattering inappropriately at the end of the 15th century. The bread and water punishment was not just symbolic. It was real caloric deprivation, intended to make the experience of being out of the community physically uncomfortable as well as socially isolating. For more serious faults, or for monks who had failed to respond to the milder stages of correction, the rule prescribed corporal punishment. This was administered in the chapter house, before the assembled community, by the abbot or a senior monk acting under the abbot's authority. The instrument was typically a rod or strap. The rule specified that monks who were too young or too intellectually limited to understand why excommunication was a serious penalty, should receive corporal punishment instead, treating the physical correction as a substitute for the shame-based mechanism of excommunication when the shame mechanism could not be expected to work. The rule's provision for corporal punishment of child ablates, children given to monasteries by their parents, sometimes as young as 5 years old, was particularly explicit. Children could not be expected to understand the full weight of monastic discipline, so the rule adapted the correction method accordingly. The documented history of corporal punishment in medieval monasteries covers both child and adult monks, with the chapter house as the standard venue, and the public nature of the punishment as an integral part of its corrective function. Beyond the graduated correction scale lay two more extreme measures. A monk who persisted through all stages of correction could be subjected to imprisonment within the monastery itself, held in a cell, cut off from the community entirely, under direct supervision. This was not a common outcome, but it was a documented one, reserved for cases where a monk had refused to change despite everything the community had tried. The ultimate punishment was expulsion. The rule provided for it explicitly. A monk who had been corrected through every available method and refused to amend should be driven out. This was considered a failure of the community as well as the individual. Saint Benedict was clear that the abbot bore responsibility for the souls in his care, and an expelled monk was evidence that the system had not worked. Expulsion from the monastery did not necessarily mean expulsion from the church or from monastic life permanently. A monk who left one house could, in principle, seek admission elsewhere, and the rule allowed for the readmission of expelled monks who returned repentant after their departure. The actual record of monastic discipline, preserved in visitation documents and chapter house records, shows a picture considerably more human than the idealized version. Monks at Hales visited taverns. Monks at other houses were documented in disputes, in failures of liturgical practice, in breaches of silence so regular that the repeated admonitions for them suggest a community where the rule of silence was aspired to more than achieved. The canons at Eggleston were punished for chatting. 3 archbishops of Canterbury died in a single year during the Black Death in 1348, suggesting that the clergy's obligation to attend the sick extended even to clergy who could see the consequences doing so. The monastic discipline system was not designed for saints. It was designed for ordinary people living in an extraordinary framework, and the graduated scale from private warning to public beating to expulsion was calibrated for exactly the range of failure that ordinary people actually produced. The records that survive make clear that the monks who needed the system's correction were not unusual. They were, in most cases, simply people who had found it harder than expected to do what the rule required. To make the strange punishments for medieval monks breaking the rules feel real, imagine the monastery before sunrise. When the walls are dark, the yard is cold, and the community is already moving according to rules older than any living brother. The point of this world was not comfort. It was continuity. Every corridor, office, object and gesture existed because someone before them had decided that prayer could only survive if it was protected by habit, labor, discipline and money. The first thing a visitor would notice was how organized the place felt. The chapter house led toward the Abbey gatehouse, while a dim record room connected the spiritual center to the working heart of the house. Nothing was placed at random. Even when buildings had grown unevenly over centuries, the monastery still tried to behave like a map of Christian order, with the church at the center and practical service spaces arranged around it like organs around a body. That order depended on people with sharply different duties. Abbots carried authority, but accused brothers and clerks often made the daily machinery work. Witnesses handled tasks that choir monks might barely see, and visiting officials revealed how closely the monastery was tied to the outside world. Medieval monastic life was communal, but it was never socially flat. Rank-shaped where a person stood, ate, slept, spoke, and was remembered after death. The material world mattered because it made obedience visible. Rule books could represent discipline as clearly as a sermon. Wax seals carried memory. Iron locks protected property and boundaries. Penitential rods served the body, while court rolls reminded every monk that holiness was supposed to be practiced through ordinary things. A monastery was not an escape from material life. It was material life arranged to point toward eternity. The 14th century made that arrangement harder to maintain. Bad harvests, war taxation, changing labor markets, and epidemic disease all pressed against religious houses that had once seemed almost permanent. Some monasteries became poorer, others became more bureaucratic and defensive. Many tried to preserve ancient customs while quietly adapting to a world in which rents, wages, mortality, and local resentment no longer behaved the way earlier generations had expected. This is why discipline, accusation, and medieval law cannot be understood as a single custom or curiosity. It touched the monastery's schedule, its finances, its architecture, and its reputation. A decision made in the chapter house could change what happened in the kitchen. A shortage in the grange could affect the refectory. A dispute at the gate could become a legal entry in an account roll. Inside the walls, spiritual life and administration constantly leaned on each other. The documentary evidence is fragmentary, but it is not silent. Court records show how officials counted, corrected, and justified decisions. Visitation reports preserve the language of obligation. Royal writs let historians reconstruct spaces that have lost their roofs, screens, and painted surfaces. Monastic rules reveal the small details that grand narratives often miss. The result is a world that can be studied through stone, ink, bone, soil, and habit. A normal day brought the subject down from theory into tired bodies. Bells interrupted sleep. Cold floors met bare or sandaled feet. Voices rose in chant before breakfast. Hands lifted tools, books, bowls, keys, or spades. The same brother might pray with intense devotion in one hour and argue over supplies in another. Medieval monks were not symbols moving through a perfect religious machine. They were human beings trying to live inside one. The emotional tone of that life was quieter than modern imagination often allows. Devotion did not always look like ecstasy. Fear did not always look like panic. Authority did not always shout. A bowed head, a careful hand, a delayed answer, or a tired walk through the cloister could carry the whole weight of the institution. The monastery trained people to control their expressions, but it could not remove exhaustion, ambition, irritation, grief, or hope. The surrounding village understood the monastery in practical terms. It was a landlord, employer, lender, customer, court, school, hospital, granary, and sacred destination. Some locals depended on it for alms or work. Others resented its privileges. Tenants might bring grain, wool, fish, rents, complaints, or lawsuits to its officers. The walls separated monks from lay society, but they never fully cut the monastery off from the economy that fed it. Women also belonged in this story, even when surviving records preserve them unevenly. Nunneries followed their own versions of enclosure, discipline, estate management, manuscript use, hospitality, and prayer. Noble women could become patrons, widows could retire near religious houses, and female servants often worked in outer spaces connected to large institutions. A history of medieval monastic life that only imagines men in choir stalls misses part of the social world that made the system possible. The architecture amplified every rule. Thick walls controlled temperature and sound, narrow stairs guided movement, screens separated spaces according to rank and ritual purity. Doorways made obedience physical by deciding who could cross and when. Light from high windows could make a church feel otherworldly. But the same complex still needed drains, kitchens, storage rooms, latrines, workshops, stables, and roofs that did not leak during winter rain. When historians describe monasteries as wealthy, that wealth should not be pictured only as treasure. It was stored in land, rights, animals, tools, harvests, rents, mills, fish ponds, books, roofs, and legal privileges. A monastery could be rich in property and still short of ready cash. It could own many acres and still struggle to repair a damaged wall. Medieval wealth was powerful, but it was often slow, local, seasonal, and bound to obligations. Conflict entered through small doors, a missing key, an unpaid rent, an undisciplined novice, a sick cellarer, a forged document, a spoiled harvest, or a rumor about misconduct could disturb the whole community. The rule promised stability, but stability had to be produced again and again by meetings, punishments, negotiations, prayers, repairs, and written records. The calm surface of monastic life was the result of constant maintenance. The same is true of knowledge. Monasteries preserved learning, but they also filtered it. Books were copied because someone valued them, paid for materials, assigned labor, and protected them from damp, theft, fire, and insects. Medical recipes, estate accounts, sermons, saints' lives, legal privileges, and musical notation all survived through institutions that had reasons to keep them. What remains from the Middle Ages is partly a record of what monasteries chose to remember. There were limits to the ideal. Monks could be lazy, proud, frightened, corrupt, generous, brilliant, lonely, or deeply sincere. Abbots could be holy reformers or ambitious managers. Lay brothers could sustain a house and still be treated as socially inferior. Guests could receive charity and still be ranked by status. The monastery preached humility, but it operated in a society obsessed with hierarchy, land, lineage, and visible honor. The dramatic claims need careful framing, because medieval institutions could be harsh without needing to become legend or fantasy. That is the key to avoiding both romantic myth and cheap scandal. The monastery was neither a peaceful museum nor a secret dungeon by nature. It was a living medieval institution, capable of beauty, discipline, exploitation, care, bureaucracy, learning and fear, sometimes in the same week and sometimes in the same room. By the late 14th century, many houses were living with the consequences of plague and demographic shock. Fewer workers meant higher wages outside the cloister and more pressure on estates that depended on customary labor. Recruitment could become harder. Buildings designed for larger communities could feel oversized. Old routines continued, but the people performing them knew that the world beyond the gate had changed in ways no customary could fully solve. That pressure makes the subject more interesting, not less. The strange punishments for medieval monks breaking the rules shows a society trying to turn belief into durable practice. It reveals how medieval people measured time, controlled bodies, organized labor, stored value, handled danger, and explained suffering. It also shows how much of daily life happened in the gap between an ideal written in Latin and the stubborn realities of mud, hunger, illness, weather, money, and tired hands. If we could stand there for one quiet minute, the scene would not feel like a fantasy version of the Middle Ages. It would smell of smoke, damp wool, wax, bread, herbs, ink, animals, and stone after rain. It would sound like bells, sandals, pages, hinges, water, and low voices. And beneath all of it would be the central rhythm of the monastery, repeated prayer holding together a complicated human machine. The final lesson of the strange punishments for medieval monks breaking the rules is that medieval monastic life was built from details. No single detail explains the whole institution, but together they show how a religious community tried to survive across generations. Stone gave it shelter, rules gave it shape, land gave it income, memory gave it authority, and daily repetition gave it the feeling of permanence even when the century around it was unstable. Another way to see the strange punishments for medieval monks breaking the rules is through timekeeping. Medieval people did not experience the day as a neutral sequence of hours. Bells divided attention, and each division carried a duty. In the monastery, time was claimed before the individual could claim it for himself. That made discipline and legal pressure feel less like an occasional activity and more like a permanent condition, something that shaped memory through repetition. The abbot had to think about the subject in practical terms. Ideals mattered, but someone still had to decide who held the key, who carried the message, who repaired the damage, who paid the worker, who apologized to the patron, and who corrected the mistake. Medieval administration was often slow and personal, but it could be surprisingly exact when property, obedience, or reputation was at stake. Inside the chapter house, the difference between a rule and a lived experience became obvious. A rule could be written in a few lines, but living it required hearing accusations, reading rules, questioning witnesses, recording judgments, and assigning penance. It required patience when the body was tired, clarity when records were confusing, and humility when a younger or lower-ranking person had to do work that kept the whole house alive. There was also a seasonal rhythm. Winter made stone rooms bitter and shortened useful daylight. Spring brought mud, lambing, repairs, and new agricultural calculations. Summer offered long working days, but also heat, flies, and the danger of spoiled food or sickness. Autumn brought rents, harvests, storing, brewing, slaughtering, and accounting. The monastery looked timeless, but its workload changed with the weather. Sound shaped the experience as much as sight. The bell did not merely announce prayer, it controlled movement across the entire enclosure. Footsteps in a cloister could reveal whether a brother was late. A cough in choir could expose weakness. A door latch in the night could become suspicious. Even silence had texture, because a silent community still produced the noises of labor, illness, hunger, and discipline. The danger of rumor becoming punishment explains many choices that may seem excessive now. Medieval communities had fewer buffers against breakdown. A lost document could threaten income. A damaged roof could ruin stored grain. A sick official could leave accounts unfinished. A scandal could reduce donations. A failed harvest could turn charity into triage. In that context, strict procedure was not just conservatism, it was a survival tool. The outside world entered through negotiation. Bishops, sheriffs, witnesses, and hostile neighbors did not simply admire the monastery from a distance. They bargained with it, depended on it, complained about it, and sometimes feared it. The gate was therefore more than an entrance. It was the place where enclosed religion met hunger, debt, labor, travel, law, and local memory. Objects carried authority because so much of medieval life depended on physical proof. A sealed rule book could settle a question that no spoken memory could settle. A seal could make an order travel beyond the person who gave it. A written list could outlive the monk who wrote it. A stored tool could preserve a technique. The monastery survived partly by turning trust into objects that could be checked. Modern viewers often look for the most dramatic image, but the deeper story is usually in maintenance. Someone swept the floor before a ceremony. Someone trimmed the lamp. Someone counted loaves, folded cloth, patched a shoe, sharpened a knife, aired a book, cleaned a drain, or carried water. Without that hidden work, the famous rituals of medieval monastic life would have collapsed within days. The evidence from court rolls, visitation records, and royal writs asks for patience. It rarely gives a perfect scene. Instead, it offers a rent payment here, a correction there, a broken wall, a missing servant, a purchase of candles, a note about discipline, or a complaint about behavior. Put together, those fragments reveal a dense human system where holiness was pursued through countless practical decisions. The atmosphere would have been unmistakably physical. Cold stone, candle smoke, nervous breath, scraped benches, and wax. The medieval monastery was not clean in a modern clinical sense, but it was ordered according to its own priorities. Some spaces were washed, swept, and guarded with care. Others were smoky, muddy, noisy, or crowded. The contrast between sacred order and bodily reality was part of the experience. That contrast is what gives the strange punishments for medieval monks breaking the rules its lasting power as a historical subject. It shows people trying to build a disciplined life in a world that kept resisting discipline. Bodies became hungry. Buildings aged. Money ran short. Novices made mistakes. Rulers demanded taxes. Weather ruined plans, and death entered without permission. Still the bell rang, the office began again, and the community tried to continue.